Now I'd like to introduce our panelist for today's broadcast, Eric Lodge. Eric is a seasoned business executive with over 15 years of financial services experience, supporting and advising companies operating overseas. Eric has a robust operational understanding in all areas of international finance, HR management, and statutory compliance. As a member of the founding Radius team, he has helped to advise on, manage, and execute international expansion plans for hundreds of C-level executives expanding corporations and institutions overseas. Over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Ed. All right. Well, taking a look at the agenda for today's broadcast, we're going to cover a nice broad range of needs as it relates to expanding overseas and hiring international employees. We're going to focus our discussion to touch on, what the headquarters-based finance, HR, and legal teams will need to be concerned with as it expands overseas. So to help set the stage and make today's topic a little bit more tangible, I'm going to use a common expansion scenario, and I'm sure that many of you on this call have either experienced it or can relate to it in some way. We'll talk a little bit about the entity establishment issues, and it specifically will review what permanent establishment is. We refer to that as PE risk, and why that's important for companies to understand and how to maintain compliance once a PE has been triggered. Once established in country, we'll go over the differences in different revenue models that the finance teams will need to consider. We'll take a look from an HR perspective, and we'll talk about what can often be some blurred lines between utilizing contractors versus local employees, as well as the implications and the risks associated with getting that designation wrong. Additionally, we'll touch on and utilize about utilizing expatriates to get your foreign operations up and operational. Expats can be considered a necessary evil at times, in the sense that they can be incredibly effective means by which to infuse company culture into your foreign operations, but they can certainly be a nightmare to plan for and to manage a global mobility policy from a headquarters perspective. Then we'll wrap up with about some 10 best practices of managing your international expansion. Have a couple of case studies that we can walk through as well to kind of set the stage some more, and then we'll certainly leave some time at the end of the presentation for any Q&A. Next slide, please. So to help set the stage for our discussion, here's an example in a common scenario that many of our customers run into, right? The VP of sales, walks into the HR director's office, has 2 signed offer letters to hire 2 new salespeople in France, and they start in 30 days. That's awesome. That's great. But there's only one problem. The company does not have an office in France. So unfortunately, the lack of planning by the VP of sales now has become a fire drill, and the problem of the HR and the finance team and the legal team to pick up the pieces and to determine how to run the payroll for these employees. In order to figure out how to payroll these employees, this will lead us to a bunch of other consideration and a number of factors that we're going to have to dig further into. The first question is, do we need an entity in country? And if so, what are those options? Unfortunately, it's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to setting up in country. Different countries have different requirements and different registration options. So you'll need to understand what it is that your company is doing in country, and this will help to frame what the immediate as well as longer-term requirements will be when it comes to setting up in a country overseas. And those can certainly change. I mean, you can start off more on a smaller scale registration, and then at some point outgrow those specific needs and might have to upgrade someplace down the line to facilitate your needs in country. So those can definitely change as you go on in time. Are you using contractors or employees, or maybe a blend of both? We'll discuss at some point in the review today what the distinction is between those two categories and how getting those wrong can cause some significant risk and be costly to your organization, but both can be viable solutions to your international strategy. What types of contracts are required to hire these new employees? It could be a contractor's agreement. It could be you need that, to have a locally compliant employment agreement. It could be that you need both. Is there a requirement like in France that you need to be mindful, like collective bargaining agreements? Depending on the level of employee that you're hiring will also require different agreements. Whether you're hiring an engineer versus a manager versus a VP will all have different requirements as far as a contract is concerned. You need to make sure that you're kind of getting that right with the local labor requirements. What are the local requirements for employment? Local labor regulations govern and mandate what is statutorily required in country, and it's different from country to country. It's certainly not one size fits all. So you really need to be in tune with the location that you're operating in and what those specific requirements entail. Lastly, will you be using expatriates or third country nationals? We'll discuss later in the presentation the various tax and immigration implications that come with utilizing expatriates, which will add to the complexity for sure.